Hello, Real Vision people. This is Sebastian Moonjava, and today we have Riccardo Spagni. He is the co-founder of Tari Labs, the former lead maintainer of Monero. How are you doing, Riccardo?
I'm great, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, also worth noting, you are well known as Fluffy Pony as well online, and that's how I know of you as well as Fluffy Pony. Let's jump into first a little bit about how you got into the crypto space. How did you discover Bitcoin? How did you discover Monero? What made you take the leap into doing this stuff full time?
Sure. So I discovered Bitcoin in early 2011. My wife and I had an e-commerce business and an import-export business as well, and that was doing really well. And it gave me a little bit of free time, a little bit of flexibility. And so I found read a Slashdot article about this Google engineer who had released a library for Bitcoin. And I was like, oh, well, if a Google engineer finds it interesting, it must be interesting. And that was, like that was the bar, and sort of went down the rabbit hole. I first thought, this is nonsense. It's never going to work. It's so trivially broken. There are all the ways it can break, largely due to a misunderstanding, or not misunderstanding, but just like I hadn't really delved into it. And so, first glance from a distributed computing perspective, it doesn't seem like it's possible. And I guess that's part of the magic of the Bitcoin blockchain, is that it's used in coming to consensus. And so it breaks a lot of the assumptions that we previously had about how that could work. And got into Bitcoin mining a bit, eventually started a bunch of companies in the space, started a payment processor called Globy, started a mobile wallet company, started a company to build and develop stuff for miners. So I invented a flat packable stackable open air mining frame for GPU miners in 2013. And yeah, all of that 2012 actually, and all of that was going really well. And then I discovered Monero before it launched, when it was still called Monero, and started mining that when it launched, and got involved with the community, and just ended up being sucked into that rabbit hole in addition to the one that I was already in.
Can you tell me, what is a lead maintainer? What does that even mean? And are you still the lead maintainer of Monero?
Great question. So open source projects have something called a maintainer, typically one or more. And lead maintainer is, normally if there's only one maintainer, you're just the maintainer. But if there's more than one person who can maintain the project, then there's a lead maintainer who sort of takes point. In Bitcoin, it's a guy called Vladimir van der Laan. A lot of people even that are even involved in the Bitcoin ecosystem may not know who Vladimir is, because typically lead maintainers don't get much fanfare. We just get shouted at a lot by users, by developers, by everyone. And our job is entirely voluntary. We typically don't get paid. We basically end up, I guess the best way to describe it is herding cats.
Okay, yeah.
We end up doing a lot of busy work. We end up having to try and convince people to revisit their pull requests that they haven't fixed in a long time. We end up massaging a lot of code and reviewing a lot of code. We typically don't always write a lot of code ourselves, because the act of maintaining requires a great deal of energy and effort. And you're reviewing so much code, you don't always have time to write a lot of code yourself. Although that's not always true. But at least in Monero's case, we had such a big group of contributors that ended up taking a lot of my time. Last year, it's 2021 now. 2 years ago, I stepped down as lead maintainer. I am still one of the maintainers, so I'm still involved. I still help review code, and part of the ongoing the discussions in the community, and especially in the dev community. But yeah, I'm no longer responsible. I'm no longer the main guy responsible for hitting the merge button when somebody submitted a pull request that's been reviewed.
I see. So how did you find Monero? And then also, after you explain a little bit about how you found Monero and got interested in that, I would love to hear a little bit about the origin story of Monero.
It's probably best to tell both of those together because they're so intertwined. So Monero's origin story is it started off with this white paper by a guy called Nicholas von Saberhagen, and he wrote this white paper for a protocol that he called CryptoNote. And what he had basically done is he'd taken Bitcoin and he'd said, look, Bitcoin does a bunch of stuff really well. Here's what we like about Bitcoin, but here's some things that we think could improve. And it was primarily on the privacy side. So that's the true innovation of CryptoNote, was like, look at all the privacy improvements that we can make. And then he also had some ideas about how mining could be more democratized, and it could really be like one CPU, one vote. And it was all expressed in this white paper. And then there was a bunch of code that came along with it, which was designed to be this reference implementation. And so along with the reference implementation, there was an actual coin called Bytecoin. And, Bytecoin, unfortunately, ended up being a giant scam. They had mined like 80% of it by the time they sent it out to the world. And so that was very scummy. And so along came this guy called Thankful for Today. We don't know his real name. And he did like a fair relaunch of that, a fair launch of CryptoNote, and he called it BitMonero. Now, BitMonero, Monero is an Esperanto word, and Esperanto is like a made-up language, like Klingon. And in Esperanto, Monero means coin. And so BitMonero literally means Bitcoin. So, frankly, not the best name, but hey, you take what you're given. Yeah. And in any event, the community and Thankful for Today had a big falling out. And so myself and 7 others forked the code base. And so what that means is we ran 2 parallel copies of the code base. So he still had the BitMonero code base, and then we created the Monero code base, which at that time was exactly the same. And the blockchain stayed the same. It wasn't like we forked the blockchain off or did anything like that. And so both his code and our code could be used to sync up to the Monero network and interact with it. But he basically abandoned his and stopped maintaining it and stopped adding code to it. Whereas we had like all the community support and everyone was adding code to ours. And so our code progressed. And eventually, sort of mid-2015, his code just stopped syncing up to the network altogether. So in that process, I was initially one of the people that mined it, and then one of the people that helped fork the code base into Monero, and just by sort of de facto became the lead maintainer.
And so both of these founders or whatever are pseudonymous, basically, right? The totally. Original guy who wrote the original code, and then the secondary guy. Thank you for today. What's his name?
Thankful for Today. Yeah, both totally pseudonymous, which is, very much like Bitcoin in that respect. There hasn't been a crazy manhunt to try and figure out who Nicholas von Saberhagen is, or who Thankful for Today are. But who knows? Maybe in a decade we'll have some article in the Financial Times discovering Nicholas von Saberhagen.
And so, what's interesting is normally when I would talk to people about Bitcoin or other open source cryptocurrencies, is that I would say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter who the founders are because it's open source. You can check the code. Is that the same for Monero because of the privacy stuff? Is that much more difficult to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So absolutely, and to be fair, the code base initially was feature complete and actually not terribly written, although a little bit obscure in places, used had some weird design choices. But what they had done, which was kind of beyond the pale, at least from an open source perspective, is they had stripped out all of the code comments. So, a lot of the time that has been spent over the last 6 years has been spent understanding how the code works and then re-engineering it, because we're adding features. And so you get to a part of the code and it's not commented. And so you figure out what it does, you add comments in, and then you're like, oh, actually we can do this much better. And you rip it out and replace it. So there's a great deal of re-engineering that's gone into it. The code base has certainly matured a lot. And I think we've gotten to a point today where Monero's code base is a lot more legible than it was initially, and where it is extremely well reviewed. I would argue probably better reviewed than if we started from scratch and written it ourselves. Yeah. Just by virtue of the need to understand how everything fits together, and having no design document, no nothing to guide you, no one you can pick up the phone and be like, hey, why did you make this decision? You just got to figure it out.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to like and subscribe for more crypto-related content. Also, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto.